like to congratulate the Holocaust Educational Trust for everything that this wonderful organization does in order to educate students here in the UK about the horrors of the past for the sake of our collective bright future. Right now we are commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was Elie Wiesel who taught, whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. This is so pertinent right now, and that is because sadly there are very few survivors who remain, and in the course of the next number of years, sadly there won't be any survivors left. And what that means is that all of us will now become the witnesses. I understand that today you are hearing from Mala Tribich, one of our truly inspirational survivors. And that means that all of us, now like her, need to broadcast her message, to let people know about these horrific details of the past, and importantly, in order to inspire whoever we know to contribute towards what will hopefully be a far better world, a world blessed by peace and stability and tranquility for one and all.
The Chief Rabbi speaking there, expressing his gratitude that we commemorate this extremely important moment in history. Well, good morning to everybody. My name is Natasha Kaplinsky and I am absolutely delighted to be working once again with the Holocaust Educational Trust for this annual live webcast to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. This year's broadcast perhaps takes on even more significance. On the 27th of January, Holocaust Memorial Day, we will commemorate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most notorious site of the Holocaust. Although 80 years seems like a very long time ago, I'm sure that by the end of today's broadcast, you will see why it is so important to learn about the Holocaust and to remember the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. Our webcast is being live streamed today from All Saints Catholic College, and we're joined here by students in years 9 and 10. I'd like to thank you all for your warm welcome and your hospitality today. Thank you very much indeed. And I know that there are also tens of thousands of young people from every corner of the United Kingdom joining us online right now. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And we know that you're going to be helping to move the conversation on later on with your questions. In a few moments' time, we're going to be hearing from the Holocaust survivor, Mala Tribich. Mala has an MBE for the work that she has done to express what had happened in that moment in history. She is a truly remarkable woman, and she has a remarkable testimony to share. As we hear from Mala, we will learn about her life before the Holocaust, and we'll pause to remember the flourishing and the vibrant Jewish communities that existed right across Europe for centuries and which were destroyed by the Nazis in a few short years. We're going to be hearing about what happened to Mala and her family, and we will also remember the thousands of other Jewish families who were torn apart across Europe. Often there was simply no one left to remember these families, their villages, entire towns simply destroyed. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we remember all of these individuals and the millions of victims of Nazi persecution. The events of the Holocaust did not just happen out of nowhere. When the Nazis took power in 1930, the racism which underpinned the destruction of Europe's Jews had existed for many centuries before. Antisemitism, of course, is often called the world's oldest hatred. Over centuries, Jewish people were excluded, they were restricted and isolated from others. They were targeted for who they were, not for anything that they had done. And today, in 2025, 80 years on, Jewish people are still targeted and attacked in their homes and on our streets. It can lead one to ask, has anything been learned from the past? But of course, one way that we can learn from the past is to hear the voices of survivors. We are now at a crucial juncture in time. Those who survived the Holocaust are becoming fewer in number. The 80th commemorative year is likely to be the last significant anniversary at which survivors are present, and this makes what we are doing today even more important. Mala is dedicated to helping the next generation learn from the past, and we are so grateful to her. I'm going to be asking Mala some questions, guiding her through her story, which she is generously sharing with us today. And then, as I said earlier, I'll give you the chance to ask some of your questions as well. I encourage you to use the question box on the microsite if you're watching online, or you can tweet us at Holocaust UK using the hashtag #MalaLive. So without further delay, it is my huge pleasure, my huge privilege to introduce Mala Tribich MBE to you this morning. Let's start by showing Mala our huge appreciation and our respect. Mala, this is a moment that I know that our students will never forget, and I would like to add my huge gratitude to you for sharing your story, which I know you've shared many times before, but nevertheless, each time you do share it, it is so important. So let's start with your birth. You were born in Poland in 1930, weren't you? What was life like before the Nazis invaded, when you were 9, and we're going to look behind at a map of Poland? What was your family like? What kind of atmosphere were you brought up in?
I was the middle one of 3 children, with an older brother, Ben, and a younger sister, Lucia. And, well, I look back on my life then as very happy. Little did I know what was to come. But I started school a year early. We used to start at 7 in Poland, and I started early because when my mother took my brother, she took me with just for the ride. And and my brother started in the 2nd year. We used to call it 2nd class, but he started in the 2nd year because he could already read and write. And then, quite by chance, the interviewer asked, what about her? And my mother said, I'll bring her back next year. She's only 6. And he said, well, let her just start, be like an onlooker, and then next year she'll do it properly. But we had to actually pass from one year to the next. It wasn't automatic. And I passed my exams, so we both started a year early. So I was lucky to get 3 years schooling. Well, my life was very happy. It wasn't as exciting as, children have today, but I did all the usual things, and we had aunts and uncles in the same town, so we had cousins, and life was really very happy.
What were your parents like? What kind of home did you live in? Just so that we can imagine what your life was like before, and then what was to come.
Well, actually, we lived in town, and there were no individual family houses in town. There were only blocks of flats. So we lived in a flat, very comfortable flat. I remember moving to a bigger flat, and we had cousins in the same town, and because the families were big, my parents' sort of age group, they had lots of siblings, and so we had family sort of in several towns in Poland that we used to visit. I actually went to kindergarten, they call it here, but preschool, and I made lots of friends. We all did, and really just quite an ordinary, lovely childhood.
It's a life that we might all recognise now, to one similar to the students are living. But very quickly, your life changed when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September in 1939. They established the first ghetto in Poland, in your hometown. And a ghetto, of course, as I'm sure you know, is a small and a confined place where Jews were forced to live before they were sent to the death camps and concentration camps. So your life changed almost overnight. Can you explain to us what the ghetto was like and what the atmosphere was like overnight?
Yes. Well, we had the first ghetto in Poland, and it started very early. Within 2 months of the beginning of the war, we were already incarcerated in ghetto walls. And there were so many restrictions, and deportations started very quickly, and not large ones at the beginning, but it ended up with just deporting everybody except people who had jobs. Mostly men had jobs, so they're around in greater numbers because women were deported. But women also worked, and at one time, well, that'll come later perhaps, I worked too. I started at the age of 12. I became a slave laborer. And there were constant deportations, but the big one came in 1942.
We'll come to that in a moment. But Mala, I just would be grateful for you to explain what it was like as a child to suddenly be incarcerated within the walls. What did your parents tell you? What did you know about what was going on throughout Europe? What did you know of the Nazis?
Well, frankly, our parents tried to keep everything from us. But children have a way of getting to know, and they listen quietly. And we could see, you know, things were really bad. We were not used to them, and people were being killed. And there was a man killed in our block of flats where we lived in the ghetto. He was shot in the hole in the entrance, and he was left lying there for a whole week. And I had never seen a dead person at that time. I had no idea. I was terrified. And so we had to sort of go past this dead man when we wanted to go in or out. And, well, I tried to avoid it, but I did see him. And there were, you know, the children suddenly were facing things they were not used to. And it was all very frightening, but our parents tried to keep as much as they could from us, obviously.
So the deportations began, as you said, from the ghetto to the death camps, and you never knew when that was going to happen or who was going to be taken. Your parents, obviously, they wanted to save you and your siblings. What did they do?
Yes, well, we knew that the deportations were imminent. I mean, really large deportations, everybody except the people they needed for work, which was 2,000 people, actually 2,100 in each place. We had two very big concerns outside Piotrków, where they employed people. When I say employed, they weren't getting paid. There was slave labor. And so 2,200 people were going to be okay for these two factories, but the rest of us were all going to be deported. And there was one possible way of saving oneself if you had help from outside. My father, together with my uncle Joseph Klein, were introduced to a man who was, we called it Volksdeutscher, which is like, he was German. He was of German origin living in Poland. And he was prepared to hide two Jewish girls for money. I don't know how much my parents paid, but it was all arranged that my cousin Ija and I will go and live in another town called Częstochowa, which is on the map, when you see the map of Poland. And after the deportation, we were to be returned to our parents. Now, my cousin Ija was very scared of, she was a year younger, and she was scared of anyone in uniform, and she was a very nervous child. She was an only child. And we did go to these people. They were paid in advance. We traveled with the man. He came to collect us one at a time. And the journey was very scary because there was actually a reward for turning in Jews. And some people made it into quite a lucrative business. And so they were on the lookout for Jews. And even though we were fair-haired and blue-eyed, we were still very scared. And it's one thing you can't hide is it shows in your eyes when you were scared. So the journey was quite sort of scary, so to speak. And but we both arrived in Częstochowa, and we were there. We were supposed to be relatives from Warsaw, and we'd come to stay for a little while. We were under false papers. But my cousin Ija, who was younger and an only child, was so scared leaving her parents, being there. She just wanted to go back. And she was told she can't go back because the deportations are still going on. But she said that her parents had very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding their valuables. That's very significant in the story. And she said they'll take her in. So this man agreed, and they went off. He came back without Ija, and I thought how lucky she was. But I didn't learn until I got back, finally, where I was handed over to my father in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with his brother. Now he was lucky to have a job there. And when we arrived, so on the second floor, it was a very large area, there was my father sitting there waiting for me, and also my uncle, Joseph Klein. He looked at us, and he went white. He says, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I brought her back. I left her with your good friends." But he knew she wasn't there. He said, "What have you done with my child?" And I remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground and pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And that's the end of the story. Nobody knows what happened to Ija. And not knowing is so terrible because, I know what I imagine, what I'm going through, but I can't even imagine what my aunt and uncle were going through.
What a searing moment in your memory of what happened, that was such a lucky escape for you, that you were brave enough to stay with this man. Although he was being paid, he put his own life at risk, didn't he, hiding you. How long were you with him?
Where did
the Christian man who took care of you?
How long did we meet? No, he lived in Częstochowa, and an uncle of mine worked there. It was already, it was during the war, and he was slave laborer, but he got to know this man. I don't know how. And he learned that he was willing to hide 2 Jewish children for money. And he introduced my parents and Ija's parents to this man, and the deal was struck.
And he saved your life, certainly.
Well, he did, yeah.
You returned eventually to the ghetto, didn't you? And there was a roundup in which your mother and your 8-year-old sister was taken.
Yes. After the deportations, quite a lot of people were in hiding during that time. My brother actually had a job in one of the factories, And my father, mother, and sister were in hiding, but 3 different families. And afterwards, we all returned. And the Germans knew that people saved themselves and are returning, but they turned a blind eye. But they had their agenda. When they thought everybody was back, and then, well, of course, when I returned, I was so relieved to still have the whole family intact. There were very few families left, and the deportation was 22,000 people or more. I'm not actually sure about the numbers. And well, we were still all together. It was like a miracle, but not for long. And all the people returning, which they sort of looked the other way and you know, pretended they didn't know. But when they thought they were all back, those that intended to come back, then they started rounding them up. And on one occasion, they stormed into the room we're in, which was very crowded. We're all illegal. So my father and brother were at work. They had working permits, so they were safe, in inverted commas. And we were in that room, we were all illegal. So they took everybody except me, because I was in bed. It wasn't that I was ill or anything, it was just somewhere to be. It was so crowded. And my mother said that I wasn't well. And somehow, miraculously, the policeman said, that's all right, she can stay behind. This is so unlike it and unusual to have happened in those days. But it did. And as my mother was leaving the room with my sister and all the other people, she said to me, she whispered to me, now stay here, don't go anywhere. And when father comes home, tell him what happened. And they were taken to the synagogue, which by now was a beautiful synagogue, which was in ruins because it's been partly bombed. They used it as stables. And they kept these people there as they were rounding up more and more people. And they had over 500 people that on the what was the date? The 20th of December 1942, they marched them out at dawn in groups of 50 to the local forest called Rakov. And there they were killed in the most horrific way. I mean, I know what happened because I read about it, but I can't bear to describe it to anybody. There are lots of books about it. There were the forest killings that were taking place all over Europe at that time.
It must be so hard for you to tell this story, no matter how many times you have, because the horror of what happened to your mother and your sister can never be forgotten. No. That was the last time that you saw your mother when she was taken from you. At that point, did you know that you would never see her again?
No, absolutely not. I think that perhaps being not a child, but just a young girl, I was by then 12. Or maybe I wasn't 12. I haven't worked it out, actually. But you know, I was just living in hope. I don't think I ever realized the real content of what was happening and how awful. And it was, I'm sure that the adults knew much more than the children, although the children always listen. We didn't know the full scale of it.
So you'd said goodbye to your mother, you'd said goodbye to your sister, you were living in the ghetto still, your brother and your father were still working, and you were now responsible for your cousin, Anne.
Well, my aunt, a Helfgott aunt, there were 2 Helfgott brothers and 2 Klein brothers, and my mother was a Klein, so there were her 2 brothers. and they had children. They had one child each, and we were 3 children in our household. And yeah, well, sorry, what did you say?
You were looking after Anne, your cousin. You were responsible.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what you had to do to care for her? Where did you get food? What were you doing every single day? Well,
my father and brother were still here, so my father saw to it that we didn't really go hungry. He had a lot of connections outside. He was a businessman, and he was in the flour mill business. He had a flour mill, actually. And well, then they rounded up my aunt, Heathcote aunt, and she was taken away screaming, "Who will look after my child?" And by then I was the only female member of the family, of the Heathcote family left, and it was down to me. I was 12 and Anne was 5, and I looked after her.
What were your responsibilities? Just taking care of her every single day, giving her food, keeping her busy?
Yeah, but not only that, I was working as well. I started work at the age of 12. I started as a slave labourer. And I used to go to work every day, but we lived in barracks with other people, other women. There were men and women, but the majority were men, and they lived at the other end of this very big compound where they were manufacturing plywood. And I used to go to work too, but because we did shifts, there were always some women there who would keep an eye on her.
What did you have to do on your shift?
Well, I was employed in a very big they were manufacturing plywood, and from the plywood they did the sections for what's I can't think of the name, the accommodation for you know, for their soldiers. They used to be packaged and sent to the front, and they would erect them there.
But at the age of 12, you were a resource for the Nazis and you were working?
Yeah.
And then after your shift, you were going back to look after Anna. In 1944, in November, you and Anne were separated, weren't you, from your dad and your brother Ben, and you were sent to a concentration camp. Can you explain how that happened?
Yes, well, one day they simply said, you're leaving. After we had been there sort of a little more than 18 months at that particular factory called Buga. It wasn't just a factory, it was an enormous concern. And, well, they said, they marched us to the station, and there the cattle trucks were ready waiting for us, men separately from women. We didn't know where we were going, but I can tell you now that the men ended up in Buchenwald, and I was the woman ended up in Ravensbrück concentration camp. And I'll just describe very quickly the arrival. We travelled for 4.5 days. We must have got some food. I really can't properly remember. But if we did, it was very little. We travelled for 4.5 days in these cattle trucks, very crowded, and people were dying as well. And when we arrived, the first thing they did was take everything away from us. They didn't bring very much anyway. Then they took all our details. They were meticulous at record keeping. And then we had to undress. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. And when we got out at the other end, we were given the concentration camp garb, this striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we really could not recognize each other. It's very difficult to describe what it feels like, to have your personality taken with you, from you, and you just, you're like a non-person, you're nothing, and it sort of gets to you, and you start caring about living because there's just nothing, even because it's, your innermost feelings, everything goes, because you're just overwhelmed by it and upset by it, and it is just a horrible feeling.
Totally dehumanized.
Yeah, dehumanized.
You'd
exactly.
lost your mother, your sister. You must have been living in absolute abject fear with no explanation of what was going on, no comfort, starving, and you were still a child. It's extraordinary to hear you speak with such precision about a time that must have been so chaotic in your mind and so full of anxiety and fear.
Absolutely.
You were in the concentration camp in Ravensbrück, as you said, for 10 weeks. At this point, the war was starting to draw to a close, wasn't it?
But I didn't know it.
You didn't know it.
No.
And at this point, you were sent to the notorious Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Can you explain how you were moved and what reason they gave you, or maybe there was no reason at all?
They never gave us any reason for anything. They just did whatever they wanted to us and with us, and one of the things that happened, just tracking back in Ravensbrück, is that one of my aunts, I had two aunts, they're two Klein aunts, and one of them became ill, and we had to leave without her. She was in hospital, and she died there. But we arrived at then Bergen-Belsen. Now, on arrival, because it was nearing the end of the war, not that I knew about it, and there were people being sent from all over the camps in Poland, not the Polish camps as some people call it, it's the German camps in Poland. And the camps in Germany were just filling up at such a rate. And when we arrived, they had nowhere to put us, so they put us up in a very big tent overnight. And it was a sort of revelation to me, because I had been in Poland quite a long time until we were deported. And suddenly there was sort of all different languages spoken, and it was all so new. And anyway, we spent the night in this enormous tent, and the next day they took us into, the camp. And what we saw defies description. It was so horrific. The first thing that hit you was the smell and the smog. And there were people there, but there were skeletons, and they were just shuffling along aimlessly. And as they were shuffling, they would collapse and die, most of them. And there were dead bodies all over. And there were piles of bodies. They tried to keep some order, so they'd put them into big piles. It was a horrific sight. And they were taking us somewhere, I don't know where, to a barracks, but they were all full. I don't know where they were going to where there was terrible overcrowding. But people were dying all the time, and there were just dead bodies wherever you went. And I heard from someone on the way that there's a children's home somewhere in the camp. And I quickly diverted from my group, tried to find it, and we did. We were interviewed by two women, Dr. Bimko and Sister Luba. And they asked us a lot of questions, and at the end they said, well, we are also very overcrowded, but we'll take you, your little cousin, but in any case, you are too old. I had just turned 12 then. So was it 12 or 14? I think I was 14 at Liberation. I'm sorry, I've got that wrong. Anyway, I was too old. So I said, okay, will you take my cousin? And they said, yes, of course. But Anne wouldn't stay without me. She was absolutely adamant. And I tried to persuade her, but she wouldn't have it. So I said to them, look, I will persuade her, but just I'll come back tomorrow with her. But when I took her back, I told her, I promised her the moon, but when we got back, she still refused. She said she wasn't going to leave me. She was so terrified of losing me.
Bergen-Belsen is described by everybody as being hell on earth, and the way that you speak about it's a picture that you paint very graphically. And yet, at the age of 14, you had so much resilience, you had so much responsibility, but I'm just wondering, what was your mental state? What was driving you at this point? You'd been through so much, you'd experienced so much sadness and fear, you'd witnessed such horror, and yet you still had a sense of responsibility to your cousin, and clearly you had some hope still because you didn't give up.
Yes. Well, I really can't tell you how I got that hope, what kept me going. I suppose I must have had some inner strength, but not that I was aware of it. I think I probably just dealt with whatever came my way in the best way I could, and luckily I survived.
It sounds like Sister Luba, even though she couldn't take you in, offered you some kindness.
Yes, she did. She did. Dr. Bimko worked in the hospital, so she wasn't there. We didn't get to know her, but Sister Luba, and there was a Sister Hermina, they were very close, and lots of others, Sister Hella and others, and they looked after us. But of course, they didn't have, they couldn't give us food they didn't have. But they used to go and, to the kitchens and beg for a little more soup for the children. They were really wonderful.
The 15th of April, 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British Army. What do you remember of that day?
Well, I had typhus. I caught typhus, which was raging, and all sorts of other diseases. And I was on my upper bunk, going through this horrible illness, and there were no medicines or anything. You either survived or you didn't. And I remember opening my eyes. I must have come into consciousness, and I saw and I was by the window on the upper bunk, so I had quite a good view. I saw people running, but it didn't occur to me that it might be the end of the war. All I could think of was, how have they got the strength to run? I mean, they weren't running fast, but how have they... Because the typhus is so debilitating, you just can't move a muscle. So that was the 15th of April, 1945, when we were liberated by the British Army.
What happened to you next?
Well, they were absolutely wonderful. I was actually left... When I came to, I realized the place was empty. They'd taken everybody to there was a garrison town next door with very nice facilities. So the children, obviously, they took there right away. But I remember being there for 2 days without anybody else. They would sort of drop in and check on me, but I was still there because I was still very ill. And then eventually, on the second day, the 2 soldiers turned up with a stretcher. And when they wanted to pick me up, put me on the stretcher, I said, no, that's all right, I can do it myself. And of course, when I tried to stand up, I promptly collapsed, which shows you that I was quite optimistic, thinking I could actually walk. It took weeks before I could walk again. So they put me on the stretcher and took me to the hospital. But they had a terrible job on their hands, the liberating people, because there were no facilities for anything. Everything had to be done very quickly, and people were dying in such great numbers, and they continued to die. They were beyond saving.
It's so hard to move you through your story so quickly, because each moment is just so horrifying that it's hard to describe. Soon after that, you received a letter from Ben, your long-lost brother.
Yes, but actually it wasn't all that soon. It took nearly a year. I didn't think anybody had survived, and we were sent to Sweden when the children recovered enough to travel. They sent quite a lot of children to Sweden, and I was one of them. And, well, I assumed that nobody survived of my family, because it took, I think, nearly a year before we found each other.
What was that moment like?
Well, I remember when we were in Sweden, we were in a school, like a boarding school. We lived on the premises, and then we were being taught very well, although the language was a problem, because there were people from Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, various countries, European countries. And when I received this letter, I remember running out into the grounds of that school. It was a boarding school, and I was holding it up in my hand, waving it and running through saying, I've got a letter from my brother. And that was really marvellous.
I've had the privilege of knowing your late brother now, Ben, for many years, and much like you, he is a formidable force and worked throughout the rest of his life, in addition to being an Olympic champion, to share his story in the hope that people learn from the past. We're moving to our questions from the students in a moment's time, but of course this, Mala, marks the 80th year, doesn't it, since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In April we're going to celebrate the liberation of Belsen-Birkenau. Can you share some of your reflections of why you feel it is so important to explain what happened to you, in the hope that our audience today, whether they're online or in this room, will take on the responsibility of knowing what happened?
Well, it's important because we don't ever want it to happen again. And perhaps if people look into it and study it and what happened and what human beings are capable of, I mean, they're also capable of creating most wonderful things, but side by side there come these atrocities. And we just hope that they'll learn something from it, really, just in a few words.
Your optimism is remarkable and inspirational. So let's now move to the questions from our audience. And please, if you are online, don't forget that you can message the question box on Twitter using the hashtag #MalaLive. The first question comes from this room, though, from a rather special student, Annabelle Kenner, who is from All Saints Catholic College. Annabelle.
Did your experience ever cause you to question your own faith?
Did your experience make you question your own faith?
Yes and no, really. There are times, you know, you sort of grab at straws where you want to live. And I remember I was occasionally praying to God, saying, oh, please don't let my mother go, or don't, whatever was happening. But my faith, I'm not sure. Really, what I always say, I'm sitting on the fence. I don't know if there is a God or not. And somebody once said to me, oh, be careful you don't fall off. But I kind of believe in God, and I'm not sure. So I'm sorry, it's not a very good answer, but I'm not sure.
You experienced the depravity of human nature, but also some kindness as well, so I can understand where that questioning comes from, and that's a brilliant question from you. Thank you very much indeed. The question is coming next from the Thames Park Academy, one of the students there. How did your parents explain to you why the Jewish people were being persecuted? What did you know of what was happening? You spoke of when you went to the concentration camp, when you suddenly realised that this wasn't just happening to your community, that you heard voices from around Europe. But what did you know of the war? What were you shielded from your parents, and what did they explain?
They didn't really explain. And whatever they explained, you know, children, and whatever they wanted to hide from us, children have a way of finding. They're listening when parents think they're not listening, or they won't understand. They speak another language. But we knew, but we didn't really know the full gravity of it. Not until we sort of experienced it for ourselves, but then there were very few children left after the war.
What was it, do you think, apart from luck, that helped you survive?
I'm often asked that, and I really don't know what the answer is. Maybe I was optimistic, maybe I was strong, maybe... I really don't know. I don't know.
You clearly, and you and your brother, had some inner steel. I mean, obviously there is some luck involved in the you know, that you weren't deported, that you weren't, you know, rounded up. But there must have been something within you that just didn't give up, because you explained such horror, and yet you had some resilience that gave you the reason to get up each day, to work in a factory, to look after your family members, and to have hope.
Well, you know, if I kind of analysed myself, I think, well, people want to live. People don't want to die. And maybe that was it. We just did our best to survive. I don't know. I haven't analysed it, and I don't know if I could. I don't have an answer to it. Probably some psychiatrist might.
Maybe there isn't an answer. From Mayfield School, a student is asking, have you been able to forgive anyone involved for what happened to you? And if so, how did you find this strength? That's a huge question. How can you forgive what happened to you and your family?
Well, I'm often asked that questions, but I don't forgive the perpetrators. But I have nothing against the German people post-war. I mean, all the ones I have met have been genuinely lovely people, and they disapprove of what happened. They would never tolerate it either if they were alive at that time. So I have nothing against the German people, just the perpetrators.
A question from St Boniface College. Have you ever been back to the camps?
Yes, I have. I went back to Bergen-Belsen quite early because they facilitated it, and it meant we met up with people from other countries that we knew in the camp, and it was sad, but it was also satisfying in a way, meeting all the other people that survived. But I didn't go back to Ravensbrück for a long, long time because they weren't in touch with me. But I have been back now a few times, and they are really lovely. They do, if any survivors come, but they have very few. When I have been there, there's only been perhaps 2 or 3 more people. Whereas Bergen-Belsen, there was really the first reunion, had hundreds of people.
A question from Mid-Kent College. What is it like to retell your experiences so many times? Why have you dedicated your life since to telling people what happened to you?
Well, first of all, I feel that people should know, and they'll read about it in books in years to come. But while they have still the opportunity of meeting a survivor, and now there are very few about, it's, you know, it's important. Actually, I would like to know what they feel about it. But I think while there's still a few survivors, and they can actually see, because it's such an unbelievable story, isn't it? You couldn't make it up, but it's very unbelievable. And well, I've sort of got to know gradually, speaking to people, how important it is to them to know. And they'll read it in books, of course, but it's not the same as meeting someone who can say, I was there.
And presumably your hope is that the students who do hear you carry on that responsibility and learn from the past so that the future is different.
Absolutely.
A number of people are asking what happened to your cousin Anne.
Well, my cousin Anne, her mother survived, and she remarried to a wonderful man who was a wonderful father to Anne. They emigrated to Australia and got married. She had children, but she was never a well person. Well, I won't say never, perhaps she was at the beginning, but ultimately she acquired some conditions, medical conditions, that, and she died. She had 2 sons, lovely fellows, we're in touch. And it was quite a lot of years after the war that we actually met up. And we were still very close, and we traveled to Australia, and they came to us, and we did see a lot of them. But she still died quite young. I think she was in her 60s.
Okay.
It's not a time to die these days.
We're sadly coming towards the end of our time with you today, Mala. Talk to us a little bit about Ben, your brother, because the 2 of you are superstars in this country. Ben went on to represent the UK in the Olympics. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, you know, the first thing I can tell you is that Ben, who's not all that sentimental, he's a man, a strong man, and, you know, he can take things. But he always used to say, if only my parents could see me. Because when he went to the Olympics, and he did it twice, and 3rd time he didn't do it was because he got, I don't know, he became ill. Nothing
he was a weightlifter,
serious.
Wasn't he?
Yeah. And he was always quite a favourite with the team, with the British team, because he was the one who carried the flag for Britain walking in. And I remember reading in one of the papers, I think in the Times, and the men we would most like to see on the winning rostrum is Ben Helfgott. So he was always he had something. I mean, we didn't always see eye to eye, but no, we were very involved with our families were always close. And yes, Ben would have been such a source of happiness for my parents, which they never lived to see.
We're returning to the room now, and another question from one of the All Saints Catholic College students. This is Luke Englishby. Luke.
So, 80 years on, what is your message for us today?
That is such an important question, Luke. Thank you very much indeed. Mala, 80 years on, what is your message to the students in this room and those who are watching us?
I can make it very long or very short. I have to make it short.
You have time.
Well, it's very important that you don't... I didn't expect this question. I just thought about it a bit more. But be vigilant. When you see injustice, don't just walk past. Do something about it. And well, there's so many ways in which you can help to build a better future. And the future, well, you are the future. So I hope that I have added a little bit to knowledge of what can happen when a civilization breaks down, and we've seen what Hitler did and what it resulted in. So, you know, not a lot more I can say.
And it was the speed at which a community disintegrated to absolute abject horror. To build on that question from Luke, do you feel that lessons have been learnt 8 decades on?
Well, I have to say, I don't know, because we're still having wars. We still can't seem to live in harmony with one another. And everything has become so politicized that I just don't have an answer to it.
That's terribly sad. One of the things that I've had the huge privilege of doing as a journalist is speaking to many Holocaust survivors. I interviewed 112 at one point. And the message was very similar. At the end of each interview, I asked the survivors whether or not they were optimistic that lessons had been learned. And the majority answered very sadly no. But you nevertheless are such an optimistic person, Mala. This is perhaps one of the reasons why you are still looking so extraordinary at this point in your life and are so active in the world of Holocaust education. Do you feel that that optimism, in part, is part of your strength?
Part of my...
Strength.
Strength. Well, maybe it is. I can't say with certainty exactly what drives me or what people think, but yes, I mean the inner sort of strength that you referred to, maybe that is so.
There can't be a single person who has been witness to this interview today that won't be seared by the memory of what you've said. Thank you so much indeed to Mala Tribich. As we have noted, 80 years ago, Allied soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau and then at other Nazi concentration camps across Europe. Concentration camps like Belsen, where Mala was liberated by the British troops. As they did so, they uncovered the darkest events in human history. When the news spread, the world declared never again. 80 years on, many Jewish people are still living in fear. So it is up to us to remember Mala's testimony, to tell others about what we have heard today, and of course, to learn from the past. You have a huge responsibility, each and every one of you, to tell this story, to remember it, to live by the lessons that we have learned. I would like to thank you all for your attention, for being such an important part of this moment, and also to thank the team at HET for pulling this webcast together, and of course, lastly, to our amazing hosts here at All Saints Catholic College, but of course to the superstar that is Mala Tribich.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.